My name is Kristen Bifus, and I'm the Executive Director of the Washington Fair Trade Coalition. The coalition is made up of 53 labor, social justice, environmental, faith, student, family farm, and fair trade businesses that are calling for trade justice, a change in our current trading policy for the United States. So we are facing some of the biggest trade agreements since the passage of NAFTA and CAFTA, which is the North American and Central American free trade agreements. Right now, in the month of July, our elected officials here in Washington State, as well as our entire Congress and Senate, are going to be voting on 3 trade agreements, one with South Korea, one with Colombia, and one with Panama. And these were agreements that were negotiated during the Bush administration in 2007. And thanks to the work of many labor and social justice trade activists, these agreements have not come up for a vote. And it is only because of pressure from corporate interests and because of our current economic problems that these are being pushed forward with the idea that these will create jobs. However, looking at our past trade policies with NAFTA and CAFTA, our trade policies are the very reason why we are in the current economic crisis that we're in now. Our trade policies are offshoring our industries, our manufacturing, our high-tech industries, causing job loss here in the U.S., and also sliding back the labor standards that have been long fought for in our country. So as our international corporations are moving work overseas, the labor standards, the environmental standards are not being abided by. And so we see a rise in sweatshops, in poor conditions for laborers where we are doing business. Also environmental degradation, where we have worked hard to have clean water, clean air acts that are guiding our corporations. Also, the countries in which we are negotiating these agreements are countries that themselves have been struggling economically, socially, politically. We saw in Central America, for example, countries that had just come out of decades of warfare, having very delicate economies, then having kind of another economic warfare being waged on them, where corporations go there, exploit the conditions, see people there not as farmers or as skilled workers. They're seen as any worker that can make anything. And farmers have lost their lands, their livelihoods. Communities have not been able to feed themselves. And workers have been pushed into the cities where there are these huge sweatshops that are making apparel and all sorts of different products that are then sent back to the U.S. and sold in shops where the cost of things are going down, but the costs are somewhere. And if it's not the consumer paying the cost, then it is the worker that is making these products that is actually paying the cost. And then there's also been a loss of indigenous rights and human rights in situations where communal lands that had been traditionally co-managed, the water and the land, are now being privatized because corporations are wanting to exploit the natural resources, mining, privatize the water, set up large-scale agribusiness. And so basically what we have been doing is working on both educating the public as well as calling on our elected officials, particularly our elected officials here in Washington State, because as a state with many ports, with commodities coming in and going out of our ports, Washington State suffers disproportionately when bad trade policies are passed. And with the current trade policies that are on the table, we are looking to lose over 100,000 jobs that will be outsourced and basically hurt the economy more here in Washington State, because that trickles down. People don't have jobs. They are not supporting local businesses. Local businesses go out of business. People no longer can afford their houses. They can no longer afford health care for their families. And we think our trade policy has by and large gotten us into this situation. And if we could have worker rights and indigenous rights and human rights and more corporate accountability, our trade policies could actually benefit more than just corporate gains. That our trade policies can be a means towards all of us sharing in prosperity so that we can all have the basic needs that we need. And we can do this without hurting the planet, because there's no reason that profit should be put either over people or the environment and the ecosystems that we share here on the planet. We, the Fair Trade Coalition, and many of our allies have felt the need to take to the streets to let our elected leaders know that people by and large are not supporting free trade as a model anymore that works. And with surveys across the country in the 2008 election cycle, many of our elected officials ran on fair trade, recognizing that this model of opening up our markets and allowing goods to flow freely doesn't actually help build stable economies. And actually, historically, the US has and still does protect our markets, protect our farmers. And those protections come in many different forms, in the form of subsidies, in the form of tariffs on similar goods coming in. And it's a way to protect our industries. And that's what's enabled industries throughout Europe, North America, Canada, Japan, South Korea to be able to grow strong. And there's many, many examples of that. So in 2008, and even before, but it was very pronounced in the 2008 election, President Obama, candidate Obama, ran on a fair trade platform. He promised to renegotiate NAFTA because NAFTA is by and large seen as a failed trade agreement. It promised to stabilize the economies of Canada, the US, and Mexico. It promised to develop a more sustainable, stable economy in Mexico. And what it did was cause millions of jobs to be lost and industries to move to Mexico, but then causing farmers to lose their land and forcing many people across the border. And this is where trade links very closely with forced migration. And immigration reform is an issue that the Fair Trade Coalition works on in collaboration with some of our partners, including the May 1st Coalition and Comité, and groups that are really working on what happens to migrant people when they come here to the US. And what we talk about is what forced people to come here to the US? Why are people coming here? Is it by choice or because they have no other choice? Because they've literally lost their livelihoods. Because for people to leave their families in the place where they live and risk life to go to another place where they don't actually have the ability to control what their lives are like, frequently working at below minimum wage with no benefits at all. It is not a choice someone makes if things are going well in their own communities. So we see a rise in forced migration from Mexico following the NAFTA, passage of NAFTA. We see a rise in forced migration from Central America following the Central American Free Trade Agreement. And we have no doubt that if the Colombia Free Trade Agreement passes, there will also be a similar rise in forced migration. And this is where farmers are disproportionately impacted. And so we've been focusing a lot on farmers when we've been educating and advocating for change in our trade policy. So I have a button here that says "Free Trade Hurts Farmers." And this is a message that we've been bringing out to communities throughout Washington State. And free trade hurts farmers here in the US as well as where we do business. So one specific example is of the most recent trade agreement that the US has made. It was with Peru. and it passed about a year and a half ago, or it went into effect about a year and a half ago. And it greatly impacted the asparagus industry here in Washington State that had been well developed. Those of us here in Washington State know we make amazing asparagus. Our climate is very well suited for asparagus. However, the asparagus industry saw an opportunity in Peru where they could go in and develop an industry there. They could save a lot of money by paying workers a lot less. They are taking land that has actually not been used for agriculture in the past. So while farmers here in Washington State lost the market and lost as the big agribusiness moved to Peru, it's not as if Peruvian agriculture farmers won. Basically, they were then employed for poverty wages. The areas that were being used are environmentally sensitive. And so the winners were big agribusiness, the big asparagus corporations, and it was not the farmers. So the farmers get squeezed. The free trade thinking is that by the US not having tariffs for agricultural products from Colombia or other places coming into the US, then that makes it easy for farmers to access our markets. But anyone who's been to Colombia would know that farming communities are quite remote, and it's not as if they have an infrastructure that enables farmers to even get to their local markets. Most farmers are subsistence farmers. They're growing for their own communities, and the roads do not allow them to actually transport large amounts of crops. And so it's incredibly foolish to think that just by negotiating this trade agreement that it really is for farmers. Because if farmers can't actually get to the nearest big town in their own country, there is no way they can actually get their products onto a boat and off to the US in a way that would make their products viable. So they very much get pinched. And we've also been highlighting farmers because farmers have been at the fore of calling for a new economic policy for the world. And there was a case of a South Korean farmer during one of the WTO meetings who actually immolated himself because he wanted to draw attention to the plight of farmers. And actually, there are very high suicide rates worldwide because of farmers that are so desperate because this is what they know, this is their indigenous knowledge, this is the hope for their communities, for their families that's being lost because of our current global trading system. And even if you're not a farmer, these trade policies impact you or they impact someone you know. Because just in our own communities, local businesses are having to compete. Local farmers, organic farmers, are having to compete with agribusiness in other countries. This is not a partisan issue. There are people, Republicans, Democrats, Greens, Independents, Libertarians, Tea Party folks, who agree that our economic system is broken. And what we really need is there to be pressure put on our elected officials to change these models, not just to document the problems or maybe to set aside resources for people who have lost their jobs. While that is definitely important, we need to actually overhaul the policy and we need to look at root causes. So we've had a series of events. We have been calling in to our elected officials. We've been sending letters to our elected officials. We've had rallies. We've had teach-ins. And we're going to continue that. These policies are going to be voted on in July. And we feel our elected officials need to hear from us. That the status quo is not working for them. We had a week of action that actually started with some call-in days to our elected officials' offices in DC to remember their constituents, to remember the situations of all of us and how trade impacts us, and to think about worker standards and labor standards and environmental standards and human rights when they are considering these policies. And then there was an incredible art exhibition focused on artists from Colombia that were showing in their works, their interactive art pieces, what has the decades of warfare and what that has done to communities in Colombia. We called on people to stand in solidarity because we, in many ways, while we're advocating for workers, farmers, people here in the U.S., we're not doing it in isolation. We are working in solidarity with people in Colombia and South Korea and Panama who are all organizing against these free trade agreements, because it's not one country wins over another. It's the corporations of both countries winning and the working people and communities losing. We focused on district offices because there's been a number of recesses, and it's really important when our elected officials are in district to make sure we're in front of them as much as possible, because when they're in DC, they are listening to corporate lobbyists. They're not listening to us. We then followed up with a huge banner that we had over I-5 where we reached some 40,000 commuters on their way to work. Ultimately, it comes down to what's important to us. Like, what does quality of life look like for us? Like, what do we value? And that should be in our trade policies. And we were inviting people to a rally. And we had a rally just last week, June 27th, where we basically trash the old trade policy. We use the model of sort of an old clunker of a car that is not really working, is broken down, has the same corporate interest in the driver's seat. And we're being sold this as a brand new 21st century trade policy, where actually it is an old policy that's just been shined up, but that nothing has fundamentally changed. And so, but we didn't want to just trash the old policy. We wanted to put something in its place. So we invited different representatives from the community, from the faith community, from the social justice community, students, fair trade organizations, labor organizations. We had over 30 organizations represented to talk about what are their values, and to actually, we have a banner, a We the People banner, harkening back to the Constitution, that we are the ones who should be the ones deciding what our policies looked like and who our elected officials should be listening to. So things like economic justice and democracy and labor rights and indigenous sovereignty and self-determination and healthy drinking water and clean air and education for all, and the basic things that we all hold true, but that our trade policies actually don't contain right now. Right now, labor standards are not in our trade policies. The right for people to control what happens to their water and their land are not in our trade policies right now. Accountability of corporations, not just to their shareholders, but to where they do business, are not in our trade policies right now. And so we created a people's trade agreement, where we advocated for what we needed and called on our elected officials to include those in all of our future trade agreements, and not to cave into the corporations and agree to these trade deals. And we've called them trade deals because they do feel that they're happening without public discourse. And we need to daylight what's happening. And for many of you, this might be the first time that you're hearing about it, because mainstream media is covering many other things. And this is not something that gets covered in detail. So if you're sort of wondering and you have a lot of questions about it, for sure, I encourage you to do your own research, because trade does impact all of us. And I know it might be something that seems confusing, but you working, buying commodities, you have the power to make choices, and your choices matter. And asking questions about where things come from and what are the conditions in which they are made is really important. And the closer you can be to the people who grow your food and make the things that you use, the more you can feel you're contributing to your community. And whether that's buying locally or buying through fair trade or buying through companies that you know are working ethically. It's a way that you can actually make sure your dollars are supporting fair trade. You can talk to your neighbors about this, and asking questions is really important. And that is really where change can happen. These issues can seem very broad. However, ultimately, it can be really simple in that we know what's not working, and we know there needs to be a more diverse group at the table to make these much better. And it's not that mysterious. We know that there have been labor unions that have been pioneering labor rights, social justice groups, family farm groups, environmental groups that have been working hard to make sure we have strong health and safety and worker standards. And that's what we're calling for. In these trade policies, it's not anything new. It's looking at the International Labor Organization standards for labor rights and looking at what are the environmental treaties and respecting the rights of other countries as we want the rights in our cities and states and our country to be respected. And we don't want corporations to be able to challenge those, because ultimately they're able to do business in these countries because the countries are allowing them to do that. And they should be adding to the prosperity and the sustainability of those areas and not in any way undermining the hard-fought advancements and laws and protections that exist in those countries. I had mentioned solidarity and sort of what does solidarity mean. In January, we had a unique opportunity where a representative from the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, a woman named Kim Jong-ran, came to share the efforts of labor and communities throughout South Korea in opposition to the South Korean-US FTA. And she was incredibly inspiring because the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions had, when the negotiations were happening in 2006, not one, but 12 rallies with over 100,000 people taking to the streets to call for their government to listen to the needs of the people. And this was students and children all the way up to older people that were so politically engaged that they felt they needed to be there. They needed to be in the street, that their voice mattered. And with South Korea, one of the reasons we are standing in solidarity with people in Korea as well as against the South Korean Free Trade Agreement is because of the issues of sweatshops. Our solidarity work with indigenous and labor organizers in Colombia is because Colombia is the most dangerous place to be a labor organizer. In the last year, 47 union organizers, labor organizers were killed, murdered with impunity. Their assassins were never found. Whether they are known or not, the community members know who is responsible, and justice has not ever been done. And so these people who have actually just advocated for basic labor rights for their communities, for their families, have lost their lives, and those are the ones who have been killed. There are many, many, many that have been threatened. Their families have been threatened. There's really a situation where labor standards are not upheld. And so in solidarity, labor organizations throughout Colombia and throughout the U.S., from the AFL-CIO to Change to Win, there's really not any labor organization in the U.S. that is in support of the Colombia FTA. And there was actually a side deal that was negotiated because there was general recognition by Democrats and Republicans alike that the situation in Colombia is quite egregious. And for us to have a preferential trade agreement when the government will not protect the workers and workers' rights in their own country is not something that we want to be a part of. So there was a side deal that was negotiated, not in the FTA, the Free Trade Agreement, which is best, but it was a side deal. And what happened as these three bills have been moving, it was moved forward without the labor side agreement. And this is why side agreements don't work with our policies, our free trade policies, because unless it's negotiated in the body, they can easily be negotiated out or just not brought forward. And this is the case. And so even people that had been in support of the Colombia FTA are no longer in support. And Representative McDermott is one of them. He has said unless there are strong labor standards, he would not support the Colombia FTA in its current format. So we call on all of the congressional and Senate leaders of Washington State to oppose all three trade agreements, but for sure the Colombia FTA, because it is the one that is the most egregious, has the least labor and human rights protections, and has the potential to do the most harm for people in Colombia, farmers, communities, as well as people here. And that's just not what our values are. It is by educating ourselves and learning. There's so many different ways of doing that these days. And then being a part of the political process, because it's when we say we can't make a difference that we're right. But if we say we can make a difference and we get involved with different groups that are working on issues that we care about, or maybe if people are not working on an issue that you care about, that you start the group, you start asking the questions. When we start talking to people about trade, that's why we have a 53-member strong coalition, many new members on the horizon, representing tens of thousands of people throughout Washington State. Because when we come together, we are very powerful. And we remember how in 1999 here in Seattle, we advocated for a different way forward on trade, and people took to the streets, and it made a huge difference. And we can do that again and in the future and draw on that power, so that we just don't accept what is currently in front of us, but think of what a people's trade policy would be and work towards making that a reality.